Hi there. Today's episode is an encore episode. I thank you once again for tuning in and listening with an open heart. And I hope that you will find, if you have listened to this episode previously, that you will find some additional new nuggets that you may have missed the first time you listened to it. And if this is your first time to hear this particular episode, again, I hope that you find a thing or two or three within the episode that might spark some additional curiosity and a willingness to see things from a different perspective. So, on with today's encore episode. Hi there, you're listening to episode number 3 of the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. If you are a returning listener, thanks for tuning back in. And if this is your first time here, welcome. We're glad you're here. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss when a new episode drops, and those drop on Sundays. For now, I invite you to settle in with a cup of coffee or tea and an open heart. And as a quick reminder and disclaimer, I am not a therapist or counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. And if you are in need of therapeutic support, such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. Now let's begin with 2 quotes. Pain is your indication that you need to change something. If you don't make a change when pain appears to tell you to make a change, suffering is inevitable. Teal Swan. The second quote, the most painful thing you'll ever experience is the closing of your heart. Leanne Rimes. As an intro, this episode will be a continuation of my own story and focusing on my experience that happened between the estrangement fracture and the reconciliation with my adult children. And as a reminder, this is my story. It's not yours. There will be parts of it that will resonate, that might resonate with you, and there will be parts of it that probably will not resonate with you. However, it doesn't mean that there's anything that is wrong or is any worse than or less worse than yours. It's simply my story. Also, I respect my adult children, and they are the owners of their own stories. As such, there are parts of my story that do intertwine with theirs that I will not talk about. I talked about that in episode number 2, and that will follow throughout this podcast at all times. If they elect at some point to give me permission to share their stories, I will do so, but until then, they are not mine to tell. So let's kind of recap what I went over in episode number 2 with the basics of how my estrangement actually occurred. Again, I was in under significant stress, dealing with a variety of different things from my professional life, my personal life, a relationship that I was in, and then my estrangement from my only children, my 2 daughters, occurred in January of 2016. And that estrangement, again, seemingly came out of the blue, although looking back and after doing the work that I've done, I recognize and realize that that was not the case. There were indicators, but I missed those. So I think it's important to recognize that estrangement, when the fracture occurs, there is, we all go through as estranged parents. And on some level, I think also for the estranged children, we go through parts of the grieving process. I think for the parents, and myself having been on both sides of the fence of estrangement, meaning I have been an estranged parent, and I have also been an estranged adult child. So I think that for the estranged parent side, the grieving process is very different, and I think on some levels there are parts of the grieving process that they experience that estranged adult children do not, if it is the estrangement occurs because the estranged adult child has initiated it. So I think it's important to kind of go through that grieving process and how I handled that, some of the things that I experienced. And I want to also say that when this first occurred, I did not consciously recognize this as a grieving process. It was just so unlike anything I had ever experienced before that I was just, the shock and disbelief in the beginning just colored and skewed every part of my perception of what I was experiencing, of what my reality was. And so what I'm getting ready to share with you is something that I did not recognize at the time. It is something I have learned, and again, hindsight's 2020. I was able to actually see, being on this side of it now, being able to see the actual grieving process that I went through. So, in grief, there's the typical stages of grief that what a person typically experiences, and these stages, there are 5, sometimes folks say there are 7, and I think that, we're all individuals and our experiences are individual as well. So whatever applies to you, take that. If it doesn't apply to you, toss it, file 13. So, but for me, the initial piece of the grief was the shock and disbelief, right? And I have since learned that the shock and disbelief that we go through with grief is a way to emotionally survive the initial shock of the loss. We numb out and shut down, and as a coping mechanism. I'm not entirely sure that I numbed out and shut down. For me, it felt like I felt all the feelings on the absolute highest setting possible. That there really wasn't a time of numbing for me. And then I went through denial, and I also learned that is an aid in processing grief. It helps again to process with the extreme loss, and that is, this can't be real. This can't be happening. This is just bizarre. Surely things are going to be back to normal, and this isn't happening to me. It can't happen to me. Things like this don't happen to me. That's complete and utter denial of what was reality. And so I did experience that, although I do think that period of time for me was very short-lived. I was pretty clear on what was actually happening, meaning I was sure that my children were out of my life. I didn't necessarily recognize it as quote-unquote estrangement. I didn't recognize it that I was actually in the grieving process. I just recognized that this was my reality, and I was not denying that part of it. And then I went through the bargaining and negotiation, the incessant texting and calling after the initial fracture, trying to get them to acknowledge me, trying to get my daughters to respond to me. And so there was this level of, I promise I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just let us get back to the way that we were. Just stop whatever this is that's happening. I want it to stop. And so whatever I need to do, just tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. Regardless of how that might have affected me personally, whatever their wants were, whatever their demands were, and how that might have affected me personally. That there was just a total disregard for that, and just this bargaining, trying to negotiate. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what it is, and I'll do it. And then that quickly moved into guilt. What where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? How did this happen? Surely it was my fault, but yet I didn't know what I had done for it to be my fault, that kind of thing. And then I think the biggest intense thing that I felt for a while was, besides the intense sadness, was intense anger. And I was so angry. After I got through the initial, shock and disbelief and the bargaining and that type of thing, I just went straight into anger. And I was so angry. I remember thinking, the audacity. How do you just cut a parent out of your life? And now remember, I had at one point in time in my life been estranged from my mom, although not for very long. And I don't recall ever thinking of it as estrangement at that point in time when I was the estranged daughter. And so it was interesting that I just had this so-called righteous anger over something my children had done, that I had done the exact same thing at one point in my life. And so I was just utterly furious with this. And I remember thinking how childish it was, and, grow up and learn how to communicate and talk about this. And I mean, I was just furious. And I wasn't just furious with them. I was also furious with their friends and like their in-laws, right? And the families of their spouses, because I remember thinking, how could you not be talking to my child about how wrong this is? That surely if this was my son-in-law who had done this to his mother, that I would just be up in arms and, ranting and raving and telling him how cruel this was and how wrong it was. And I was just furious that seemingly no one was talking to my girls about the pain and heartache that this was causing. Again, I was so wrapped up in my own self that I couldn't process the fact that I had no idea if their in-laws were talking to them, if their friends were talking to them about this. I don't know. I had no way of knowing that for sure, but because I was so wrapped up in my own hurt and my own pain, I was not thinking rationally to think, oh, maybe they are. And maybe my kids are electing not to listen. Maybe they have had those talks. Maybe their mothers-in-laws have had that conversation with them. Or maybe their best friends have said, what are you doing? I had no way of knowing if that was actually happening or not. So I was creating my own reality through the pain that I was feeling at the time. And I was also very mad at my friends who were leaving, and that no one was coming, quote unquote, to bat for me, right? No one was standing up for me and saying, this is wrong. What you're doing to your mother is wrong. My parents did do that to a degree. They were pretty upset at my pain, which is interesting, right? Because my mom and I had been estranged at a time or two in my young adult life, and then here she was being upset that this was happening to me. So, but there was a lot of anger involved, and once I was able to get past or move through that anger, thanks to therapy. There was a big part of that that came into play with that. And then I also, folks said that, were you depressed? And my kids thought I was depressed because of all the emotional turmoil that was happening in my life. But I don't feel that I was depressed. I feel that I was living life. I was feeling life. I was not numbing out. I was not, pretending things weren't happening. I was not off in some la la land somewhere. I was in the throes of feeling all of my emotions. And to some people that can look like depression, especially if you're crying all the time, right? But I was not depressed. I was still getting up and going to work. I was getting dressed and showered every day. I was still doing all the things. I was just really feeling all the feels. And so, and that's what my therapist said at one point in time. She said, you're not depressed. You're doing this thing called life, and you're feeling all that comes with it. So, and then the biggest piece of this was the shame and the withdrawal from society, as far as the grieving process, right? I went through the shame that comes from it just goes to the core of who we are as parents and can profoundly affect our self-esteem. And that's what it did to me. And I also could not bear to be around others who were living a happy life with their kids and their grandkids. It just ripped me to shreds. And so I began to withdraw from society, and, the shame that I felt just intensified all of that. And I'd like to give you a definition of shame that Brene Brown, who is she has a PhD and is a researcher, and she has researched shame. And her definition of shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are not worthy of love and belonging. So the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. And that's exactly how estrangement felt to me, that I just was not worthy of being loved. Because by my God, if your children don't love you, then who the hell are you, right? Like, our kids are supposed to always love us forever and ever, amen. And if my children didn't love me, then surely I wasn't worth anything, any love or belonging anywhere. So, one of the things I kind of want to expand a little bit on the shame piece, because I think it's a huge piece that happens to all estranged parents. And I think that it happens also to the estranged adult children too, on some level, because it's, in our society, it's really shameful that you're not involved in your family. You're not, that you're not involved in the life of your children and or your parents. And so, shame requires three things to keep it going, right? And that's secrecy, silence, and judgment. So when you have those three things, shame remains ever present. And, like most problems and issues that are left in the dark, they tend to grow. And so shame cannot survive being spoken. So I had to learn how to talk about my estrangement, and so that I could crawl out of the shame closet. So one of the things that I learned in the midst between the fracture and reconciliation is that actually what I was experiencing, there was a difference, because people would say, but you're at least your kids are alive and they're not dead. And I couldn't wrap my head around, okay, so my pain is less than, because my kids are still living. And so I learned that this thing that I was experiencing was called ambiguous loss. And it's a term that was coined by Pauline Boss, a PhD, back in 1970. And it differs from quote unquote ordinary loss of, such as a death, in that there is no verification of death and no certainty that a person will come back or return to the way that they used to be. So, and why does that matter? Right? It causes confusion, and it prevents a resolution of loss, and it freezes the grief process. It paralyzes that process, because there's no resolution. It's just this ongoing loss every day. It doesn't lessen. It just happens every day. And so there are different types of ambiguous loss. There's physical absence with a psychological presence, and that's what we more commonly know as estrangement, divorce, adoption, and immigration, things like that. More catastrophic events are like kidnapping and victims of earthquakes and tsunamis and things like that. And then the second type is a psychological absence with a physical presence. And some of examples of those are, someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, different types of addictions, TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, depression, etc. And so, how do we ease the effects of ambiguous loss? There are 6 guidelines of sorts of building resiliency through that. And that's, finding meaning, adjusting mastery, reconstructing identity, normalizing ambivalence, revising attachment, and discovering new hope. And all of those things are things that I went through in therapy to be able to move through my estrangement and not get stuck. And so I started that transition. I got myself into therapy, and I kind of break that down into 3 different parts, if you will. And the first one is I had to feel all of my feelings first. I had to feel them. I had to have them witnessed and not judged. I had to be validated and feel that that my worth and my value as a person was mirrored back to me. And that's all the things that my therapist did for me. It was a safe place for me to go and vent. And there were days that I went into therapy and I sobbed and, just could hardly talk because all I could do was just immensely sob. And there were times that I went in when I was just raging with anger. And all of that was witnessed by my therapist. None of that, at no point in time was I told I shouldn't be angry or I should, suck it up and not be crying anymore. And it was time to get over it and move on with life. And none of that. I had to feel all the feels. And then I got to a place where I had to decide, what did I want? And that place came gradually. It wasn't like I walked into the therapist office one day and said, okay, I'm done with feeling all the feels and now I need to just figure out what I want and move on from here. It was a gradual process that happened over a period of time. And, I had to decide, what did I want? And as I was preparing for this episode today, I went back through and really listed out all the things that I wanted when I was in therapy and trying to figure out how to get past what I was feeling at that time after the fracture. And some of the things that I wanted at that time were, I wanted the pain to end. I did not want to end my life, but I wanted the pain to end. I wanted to get out of the quicksand and to figure out how to accept what was, how to just let it be. And that was a foreign concept for me. I had always been a person who was in charge, fixing things, taking control of matters. I worked in careers where I was the one having to make decisions and getting people from point A to point B and just a take charge kind of person. And so I had no control over this. And so how was I going to learn how to just let it be and accept what was actually happening? So I worked through that with my therapist. I worked to find joy again. How do I find joy again when I'm so sad and my kids aren't here and my grandkids, I can't see my grandkids who had at one point brought me such joy. And so I had to figure out, where am I going to find joy again? What does that look like? How do I do that? Where do I start? Where do I begin? And then I also had to find purpose again, because I think, and especially for moms, we're wrapped up in our children's lives, and finding our own purpose, something for us, is something that most of us are not so good at. And I want to also say here that it's not always, being wrapped up in our children's lives doesn't always look like a helicopter mom. So for me, I was a helicopter mom in the fact that I was controlling, and that was my way of protecting what I felt was protecting my children. Because I had had so much unknown and things in my life that I wasn't in control of, I grew into an adult trying to control everything. And I also experienced at a very young age with my young children a lot of trauma and things, painful experiences that I wanted to protect them from. And so my helicopter mom did not look like oh, here, honey, let's make sure you eat all your vegetables and make sure you've got this and that and the other thing. And, making sure you're taken care of. And, oh, here, I bought you this because I know you'll need this off at college. And that was not my helicopter mom style. My helicopter mom style was, don't do this because this may happen. So I just want to make that clear, in that it doesn't always look like what we think it might look like. And so I had to learn how to back off of that and to get involved in my life instead of being involved in their lives. And I think we as moms struggle with that. And then I had to learn how to be in relationship differently with people. I wasn't in relationship with people. Again, my friends had left. I certainly was not seeking out new friendships, and because I didn't trust, because I was just so hurt, and I was like, well, if my kids can leave, that means anyone can leave at any point in time, and I'm just not risking that, right? And so I had to get right with myself on that. And I also had to figure out, did I want to be in relationship with my children again? Did I actually want that? Because I could have chosen not to, right? So I had to make that decision. Did I want to be in relationship with them? And if so, how do I move from parenting to being less involved in the lives of my children? I had to figure that piece out. And then I had to learn how to feel safe in the world again. Estrangement caused me to feel as if nothing in the world would ever again be stable, and absolutely nothing and no one could be counted on. And this played into my own personal abandonment issues from childhood. And it just really, I just felt like the world was an unsafe place to be, that I didn't feel connected to anyone, and that there was stability and safety within my world. So how did I move on from there? How did I move through the grieving process, through feeling all the emotions, figuring out what I wanted out of life to get towards what is we now know is the reconciliation that I have with my children. And the first big piece of that process for me was in getting curious. And I speak to that, what I spoke about previously, is I had to figure out, what do I want? I had to get curious about, how do I feel joy again? How do I end the pain without ending my life? All of those things, that came from getting curious. And I also had to get curious about, how did we get here? And so I learned, again, about the little T traumas, and for both myself and my children, and then us together as units of mother and daughter. I learned about attachment styles and needs, and I learned more about our codependent and enmeshed relationships with my daughters, and that is what allowed me to begin to shed my armor and open my heart a little bit more to possibilities and potentials, and to remain with hope. So to me, curiosity is the key to everything. Without that, I feel certain that I would not have reconciled with my children. I had to get curious, and I had to have an open mind. And so that kind of brings this all to a close, if you will. I just wanted you to know before I moved into the reconciliation that there was a huge process in between the fracture and the reconciliation. It wasn't just that the fracture happened and then, everyone was pissed off and then everybody got to be happy again, and then the reconciliation happened and life is just a bed of roses. That's not how this process works. There was a lot of work in between. And I wanted you to know that there is that grieving process, and then there is that process of trying to make decisions so that I could get out of being stuck in the grieving process. I did not want to remain there. I had to figure out a way of moving on with my life, whether my children were in it or not. I was no longer willing to sit in that pain, in that misery, and I had to figure out a way out. And for me, that was getting curious and being in therapy and having my therapist there to help witness what I was experiencing and helping me to sort through those feelings and those desires and how to take the next steps forward. So this brings episode number 3 to a close. The continuation regarding the reconciliation with my daughters will be on episode number 4. And I hope that our time together is something that you feel was well spent. If so, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. Leave a positive review. That would be very welcomed as well. If you are an estranged parent or an estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on this podcast, please reach out via email to me at theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Again, theestrangedheart@gmail.com, or by leaving a voice message on the podcast at anchor.fm/theestrangedheart/message. And those voice messages come directly to me, and I'm happy to answer those or respond to you as I can. So again, thank you for joining me for this episode of the Estranged Heart podcast, and know that I'm holding each of you, those of you who are estranged, in my heart. I know the pain of estrangement from both sides of the coin, as an estranged adult child and as an estranged parent. And I'm holding you close. Take care.